Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Color of New Media Working Group and the Berkeley Center for New Media's Media Crease Symposium. My name is Gail DeKosnick, and I'm an Associate Professor of New Media and also of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies, and I'm currently the Director of the Berkeley Center for New Media, which we call BCNM. First, a bit about BCNM. BCNM is an interdisciplinary research center that studies and shapes media transition and emergence from diverse perspectives. Through critical thinking and making, we cultivate technological fairness and equity in our classrooms, in our communities, and on the internet. Along with my colleague, Professor Keith Feldman, who you'll be seeing in just a moment, I am the faculty co-organizer of the Color of New Media Working Group. The Color of New Media is a working group based at UC Berkeley that focuses on technology and intersectionality. We discuss and produce scholarship on BIPOC, women, LGBTQ+, and global South, lower and middle income country makers and users. The question that led to the group's origin was, is the color of new media white? Meaning, why do academic studies and popular narratives about technology so frequently privilege white inventors and white users? The Color of New Media seeks to diversify new media studies by researching technological phenomena, platforms, and practices through the lenses of critical race theory, gender and sexuality studies, disability studies, environmental studies, global South and diaspora studies, and social movement studies. Issues currently of interest to the group are social media and social difference, diversity in television, film, music, and gaming, political fandoms, and how to define key concepts and moments in the history of new media. Our working group's first book, #Identity, hashtagging race, gender, sexuality, and nation, was published in an open access edition by the University of Michigan Press in 2019, and my wonderful staff members will put the link to that book in the chat right now. BCNM and the Color of New Media Working Group are committed to promoting technological equity and justice, and as such, our free events are inclusive, respectful, and harassment-free spaces. We invite everyone to participate by responding to tonight's lectures in the chat or in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we ask that all attendees help us maintain a respectful space. Attendees who violate our guidelines will be removed from the event and may be disallowed from future online BCNM events. If you're new to our events, welcome, and we'll share a link to our community agreements in the chat. I would now like to take a moment to honor the land. We recognize that Berkeley is located in the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded lands of Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone peoples, specifically the Confederated villages of Lishan. The history of prolific technological development in this region has always depended on this land, and all of our technological infrastructures and activities take place on and in relation to this land. We commit to supporting the sovereignty and ongoing stewardship of this place by Ohlone peoples through building long-term reciprocity and relationships with tribal leaders and organizations. I would also like to honor the Waray peoples of Leyte Island and the Lumad peoples of Mindanao Island in the Philippines, my homeland, and the Tongva peoples of Shuang Na, place of the rushes, now called Lomita, California, where I grew up, and also the Ramaytush Ohlone tribe, in whose Aboriginal homeland I now reside in what is called the city and county of San Francisco. Tonight, we're honored to have two very special guests. Professor André and Professor Karen Tongson share their interpretations of the media crease and how it relates to their work. The media crease is a term I formulated to name the visible or sensible traces of the repeated use of a media object. Media creases can be found within media texts or on single media platforms or within particular media genres or formats, and they can also occur across text platforms, genres, and formats. There is always a temporal dimension to the media crease. The crease is always evidence of persistent and repeated use over time. But the time frame for a media crease is variable. A social media crease might last a day. A discursive media crease, such as the American dream or meritocracy or white supremacy, might unfortunately last for centuries. Framing media creases in this way opens on to questions about how, as Ruth Gilmore says, fatal couplings of power and difference materialize in time, place, and form. The lines creased into media social context include the color line, theorized in its global and local scales by W.E.B. Du Bois, the border line, embodied so poetically in the philosophical work of Gloria Anzaldua, colonial modernity's persistent anthropocentric lines so radically troubled by Sylvia Wynter, the intersecting lines of race, gendered, sexual, and capitalist oppression conceptualized so eloquently by the Combahee River Collective, and more. It is out of and in conversation with these creases that our project emerges. The Media Crease is the subject of a forthcoming collection currently developed by the Color of New Media Working Group, tentatively titled The Media Crease, Technological Repetitions, Resurgences, Hauntings, Loops, and Folds. Now I will introduce my fabulous colleague, Keith Feldman, who will in turn introduce our wonderful speakers. Keith P. Feldman is Associate Professor of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. He is also affiliated with Program in Critical Theory, the Berkeley Center for New Media, and the Center for Middle East Studies. An interdisciplinary cultural studies scholar, Keith's work examines the interface between race, knowledge, and imperial cultures, with a focus on the US, West Asia, and North Africa. Keith is the author of A Shadow Over Palestine, The Imperial Life of Race in America from 2015. He's also the co-editor of our book, #Identity, and co-editor of a special issue of Social Text on race, religion, war, and is also the editor of a forum for comparative literature on Blackness and relationality. Hi, Keith, take it away.
Hi, Gail. Thanks so much. It's really exciting to be here this evening, and I'm so thrilled to get us underway with such incredible presenters. So I'll go ahead and introduce our first guest speaker for the evening, Professor Karen Tongson. Professor Karen Tongson is Professor of English, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and American Studies and Ethnicity, and Chair of the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Southern California. She's the 2019 recipient of the Lambda Literary Jean Cordova Award for Lesbian and Queer Nonfiction, and the author of two amazing books, Why Karen Carpenter Matters from 2019 and Relocations, Queer Suburban Imaginaries from 2011. Tongson's writing and cultural commentary have appeared in NPR, Los Angeles Review of Books, LA Weekly, BuzzFeed Reader, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and Public Books, as well as in other scholarly and public forums. She has two books in progress. The first is entitled Empty Orchestra, Karaoke, Queer Performance and Queer Theory, forthcoming from Duke, and Norm Porn, Television and the Spectacle of Normalcy, forthcoming from NYU Press. Postmillennial Pop, the award-winning book series she co-edits with Henry Jenkins at NYU Press, has published over 20 titles. Previously a panelist on MaximumFun.org's Pop Rocket podcast, she now co-hosts the Gen X-themed podcast entitled Waiting to Exhale with Wynter Mitchell-Rohrbach. Please join me in welcoming Karen Tongson this evening.
Thanks so much for that generous introduction, Keith, and thanks to Gail, Malika, Rashad, Sophia, Laura, everyone at the Berkeley Center for New Media for having me here today. I'm going to go ahead and get my slideshow up and running so that we can lose ourselves in the talk today on soft rock, soft power, which will be very music heavy. So I hope you enjoy the discussion about music. It resides very much in the media crease that Gail discussed at the beginning, the kind of repetition of certain forms that evolve and signify differently across these registers, transnationally, transpacifically, et cetera. So I'll start with a little music. It feels so innocuous, these viennetta chords stretched luxuriously over strings before they melt into the gentle arpeggios of a barely amplified guitar kept on task by the steady, tender click of the snare rim. Like the sound of a flamingo stretching one of its skinny but sturdy legs, backlit by a sherbet sunset, this cherubic voice enters, neither male nor female in the way late 70s falsettos flirt with unsexing themselves, only in a manner that implies it may have never been sexed to begin with. The voice tells us matter-of-factly, with a nonchalance befitting small talk, that it's not far down to paradise. For those of you too young or not Filipino enough to recognize this song, it's Christopher Cross's Sailing, one of the most enduring hits of 1980, which is saying a lot when you review the Billboard Hot 100 of that year, which included Blondie, Pink Floyd, Michael Jackson, Queen, and Billy Joel. Sailing has resurfaced ironically and unironically as an emblem of what has been generically backdated as yacht rock, a genre of West Coast rock or FM soft rock that I'm going to describe later in greater detail. NSYNC even covered Sailing on their eponymous debut album in 1997. Classified as the biggest soft rock hit of 1980, Sailing also earned the Singing Songwriting Cross a Grammy for Best New Artist, just in time for the dawn of the Reagan era and its many mornings, not to mention plenty of mourning with a U in America. I open with a soundscape of ennui deluxe, a term the filmmaker Katie Puckrick used to refer to yacht rock's self-indulgent melancholia to establish the premise of this talk. In the softest things lurks the most insidious forms of power. I also hope to lead us eventually to another lesson, one that the artist E.J. Hill's lesson number 3 inscribed in neon across a blackboard. Tenderness is our superpower. In popular and scholarly discourses, music, voice, and sound have been, at varying moments, regarded as democratizing global media, capable of traversing borders and the problems endemic to national boundaries, including conflicts about sexuality, race, and power. And yet, American popular music has also been weaponized, very recently enlisted in the Gulf Wars, or the so-called War on Terror, to subjugate those within its auditory blast radius and not so secret torture chambers with genres like heavy metal, death metal, or even Toby Keith's jingoistic country rock, specifically his album Shockin' Y'all in 2003. These harder, overtly violent, and martial applications of US popular music and sound technologies include the deployment of LRADs, or long-range acoustic devices, to stifle protests in sites of US occupation from South and Central America to Southeast Asia to the Middle East and North Africa to here on indigenous lands. Raven Chacon, a composer, activist, and multimedia artist from the Navajo Nation, undertook a sound-based project for Documenta 2017, which I believe is still ongoing, that repurposes LRADs to, in his words, broadcast stories and songs of recent forced displacement and transformational journeys told in a variety of languages by multiple speakers during a time of one of the greatest mass migrations in history. While these large-scale displays of acoustic power draw our attention, indeed they provide a visual spectacle to accompany the sonic flex in expansive landscapes from the Iraqi desert to Standing Rock, I'm interested in the forms of auditory power that barely garner our attention. The soft sounds loitering with a crisp glass of Chardonnay in the background. The sonic repertoire that provides ambiance in circuits of leisure, the smooth sounds that don't disturb as much as they soothe, flowing across cultural boundaries with the ease of a summer breeze that makes you feel fine. I'm talking, of course, about soft rock, an FM radio format that emerged in the 1970s out of the capacious category we understood earlier in the century as easy listening. Easy listening arose in the baby booming decades predating the rock era, born of the confluence of instrumental styles like big band jazz and light orchestral pop from the 1930s through the early 1950s. So think Mantovani, the Lawrence Welk Orchestra, or the Percy Faith version of A Summer Place. As pop music scholar Keir Keightley points out, easy listening's, quote, disparate styles share a disposition toward musical experience that privileges the listener over the performer and thus emphasizes the functionality rather than the autonomy of music. Even after soft rock sprung from the loins of the singer-songwriter scene in the late 60s and early 70s, so I'm thinking here of Laurel Canyon and West Coast rock, easy listening never went away. In fact, it endures today in sleek hotel lobbies that sell you $20 cocktails, or on your Spotify Mellow Monday mixes, or as my Waiting to Exhale podcast host, Wynter Mitchell-Rohrbaugh, noted in a recent episode, preloaded onto the sound bar in your Cabo hotel room. In my mind, soft rock is a tributary of easy listening, whereas easy listening began as a category that catered to consumers in order to sell long-playing albums, LPs for the hi-fi, for those of you who remember. Soft rock was spawned by the emergence of niche consumer radio formats like AOR, album-oriented rock, or adult contemporary music, which captivated largely female listeners in the 25 to 55 demo from 1973 onwards. The term soft rock itself, as both Ann Powers, Andy Zaks, and I have also ventured to guess, is a backdated term, meaning, a term that was created later to apply retroactively to a genre of music heard on the radio that contrasted with what was actually increasingly being referred to in that era as hard rock from 1968 onward. So because there was a hard rock, eventually someone decided to call everything that wasn't hard rock soft rock, right? So similarly, the song I opened with today, Sailing, belongs to what is ubiquitously referred to now as yacht rock, a subgenre of soft rock or adult contemporary music that wasn't even created until 2005 as part of an early YouTube comedy show by J.D. Reisner and friends. Yacht rock was retroactively applied to an entire swath of soft rock or West Coast oriented album rock from the years 1974 through 84. So soft rock was already a backdated term. Yacht rock became then a subgenre, a backdated subgenre within that broader category from the early 70s onward. So some of the hallmarks of yacht rock include not only songs about boats, or that would seem endemic to a boat like Sailing, but also light musicological signatures like the doobie bounce, the mid-tempo pocket in What a Fool Believes, which veer towards certain low-key flourishes of blue-eyed soul, unobtrusive woodwinds, and the aforementioned ennui deluxe, or an affluent sadness haunting paradisical environs and excursions. Before I transition out of this extensive historical foray into format, I obviously have to play a little bit of yacht rock's locus classicus for you, the Doobie Brothers' What a Fool Believes. Oops.
Anybody else would surely know he's watching her go. But what a fool believes he sees. The wise man has the power to reason away.
Okay, so that's all of the What a Fool Believes you're going to get today. Besides hearing the beard and everything Michael McDonald sings, this McDonald and Kenny Loggins pen gem is actually quite tragique in its lyrical themes. Despite the music's groove in the pocket, that doobie bounce that J.D. Reisner and the other dude creators of the yacht rock moniker so accurately pegged. What a Fool Believes is essentially a song about a totally conjured closeness, a fantasy of something more in a relationship that a hubristic man has projected onto a later encounter with a woman from his past. As MacDonald and Loggins explained in a Wall Street Journal conversation about the creation of the song, quote, at their sit down, he, the man in What a Fool Believes, he's foolishly optimistic and believes they'll get back together. For her, it's just a cordial get together to have a drink. The musical setting for this concept, meanwhile, was, in MacDonald's words, meant to be, quote, sharply rhythmic, like those 60s singles by the Four Seasons, the Four Tops, or Edwin Starr. What MacDonald's remarks offer the shorthand for here, and I don't have the time to walk through it all now given our time constraints, is that despite the pervasive white masculinity of soft and yacht rock, its musical influences are liberally pulled from Motown, contemporary R&B, Quiet Storm, its Black bourgeois compatriot, beautifully animated by the late Rashad Ollison, as well as what's been referred to since the mid-1960s as blue-eyed soul. But to continue on just briefly with the fool and what he believes, he's watching her go, but a fool believes he sees the wise man has the power. As a kid in 1979, when my parents were bumping this song from their 8-track in Honolulu to learn it for their own future gigs, I always heard that last lyric as the white man has the power. Apropos that mishearing of the lyric, and in my signature move of reading askew, I wrote about this particular practice in ASAP J. So if you have questions about it, I'm happy to share a link for you after the talk. I'm going to transition now in the second half of this talk from focusing on soft rock's origins and taxonomies to the kind of power it exerts not only in the US, where I just offered this extremely brief genealogy of its emergence, but in the circuits of leisure I referred to earlier in the Pacific Rim. Soft rock's ascendance and its enduring sonic ubiquity in places like the Philippines coincided with a period of US imperial disintegration in the Asia-Pacific region, during which its overextended military involvements were collapsing under the weight of its disavowed imperial ambitions. From the Watergate scandal that eventually led to Nixon's resignation at home, to the fall of Saigon in 1975, to the rising anti-authoritarian folk music-driven protest movements into strategic sites like South Korea, see, for example, Susan Huang's forthcoming book on protest music in South Korea from the 70s, to the unwavering support the US offered Ferdinand Marcos's regime in the Philippines in a desperate bid to ensure its continuing relevance in the region, the white man's power seemed more foolish and phantasmatic with each passing global realignment. Add to this mix the bicentennial in 1976, a national projection geared to forgetting and erasure in so many ways, as Sarah Kessler has argued in her book In Progress, Anachronism Effects, and you have a convective cycle of escapist denial and me-decade soul-searching fueling these soft, masked, soulful explorations into the psyche. In other words, soft rock became a compensatory, almost accidental iteration of US soft power in the 1970s to replace the hard, coercive militarism that lost its aura amidst the failure of the American war in Vietnam. Okay, for some reason it's not letting me there we go. Soft power, as many of you might already know, but I'll offer a quick definition here nonetheless, is international relations parlance for the ability to influence long-term attitudes and preferences through diplomacy, as well as values and culture. Coined by Joseph Nye in the late 80s and popularized in his 1990 book, Bound to Lead, The Changing Nature of American Power, soft power resources are, quote, the assets that produce attraction, which often leads to acquiescence. Nye adds that seduction is always more effective than coercion, and goes on to explain why values like democracy, human rights, and individual opportunities are, quote, deeply seductive. And students of imperialism and colonialism know this sounds a lot like cultural imperialism, but we can talk about the distinctions between a concept like cultural imperialism and something like soft power and what those distinctions are once more in the Q&A portion of the talk. What could be more seductive than getting caught between the moon and New York City, or a sip of brandy, who happens to be a fine girl, or doing magic, or doing what you won't do for love, or maybe just plain breaking away? As I explained in Why Karen Carpenter Matters and elsewhere, the smooth sounds of not only the Carpenters, but other purveyors of easy listening, soft rock, and that blue-eyed groove that came to be known later as yacht rock, are, as the kids and the really old say, canon in the Asia Pacific region. There's actually a really interesting article that was published last year in the Atlantic on John Denver and his sort of lingering significance specifically for Korean Americans. One historical and technological explanation for this, as I mentioned in the Karen Carpenter book, was Armed Forces Radio, or AFR, part of the Armed Forces Network, or AFN, and its decades-long saturation of the airwaves with palatable pop in places with a significant US military presence like the Philippines, Vietnam, and Korea. The shorthand cultural example I refer to repeatedly is the story peddled in the 1987 film Good Morning Vietnam about the Air Force DJ Adrian Cronauer, real-life DJ, who repeatedly wound up in hot water for playing rock and roll in Motown, veering away from the sanctioned, softer repertoires sourced from the easy listening charts. As Natasha Frost explains in a piece about Cronauer, who's actually extremely conservative in the long run, AFVN played a bland selection of easy listening American charts. Frank Sinatra, Tony Bennett, 1950s pop. More ribald choices like the Beatles' Why Don't We Do It on the Road would earn a station a slap on the wrist. So some veterans bemoaned the snoozy tunes and country music favored by military stations. And, you know, this is something actually from the Armed Forces Radio Archives, about basically the expansion of their radio and broadcasting network, or what they call the Jungle Network, throughout the Pacific Theater during World War II and beyond. Cronauer and his ilk aside, AFR and the AFN were the most effective sonic conduits of soft power beyond their intended listeners, i.e. the soldiers who were basically tasked with listening to it on base. They broadcast American pop music into the provinces and onto the beaches, island communities, and other enclaves who found it easy to sing along to slower, but still occasionally grooving tunes with pristine vocal production as its focus. So that's one thing that I want to underscore, is that soft rock, yacht rock album, this kind of adult-oriented album rock really had high production, vocal production value. And so that's part of like the argument that I'm making here, is that there's something about being able to listen to, make the words out to, and learn the English language through this music that also made it appealing. Also, for an insider take on AFR soft power, the US Army itself published a story by one of its officers, George Smith, called Airwaves Carry US Culture to Unintended Audiences in 2013. Although his piece focused largely on Europe and about how AFR influenced a generation of young people who heard AFR in the European theater, from British musicians like Robert Plant to politicians like Germany's former Green Party foreign minister, Joschka Fischer, et cetera. I'd also invite you, if you haven't listened to it yet, to listen to the Winds of Change podcast about how that particular Scorpion song was a soft power op in many respects to bring down the Berlin Wall. But moving on, there's much to say about the pervasive and unrelenting whiteness of soft yacht and another category of rock called spago rock that I can talk about later. All are backdated categories that carry with them a structure of willful deracination, one that predictably obfuscates the Black sources for their sonic appropriations. I want to add here that as far as I'm aware, in the actual listening practices of these genres, largely in the Philippines and the Filipino diaspora, what Jennifer Stover has described as the sonic color line is far more porous. Quiet storm, jazz fusion, and the less explicitly Caucasus taxonomies of smooth sounds flourish in the popular listening landscape, which is also owed to AFR, AFN. And think about the deployment of largely Black and brown soldiers all over the world. So that's how you get something like Quiet Storm sometimes mixed into that repertoire. Indeed, artists like Angela Bofill, Al Jarreau, James Ingram, or Stanley Clarke and George Duke are enduringly popular in the Philippines on the radio, on TV, and in karaoke repertoires, which is a true index of standard listening practices anywhere in the world, as much as they are, if not more so than they are popular in the US. So Angela Bofill, for example, who Allison lamented was never fully appreciated, even during the height of her relatively regional commercial success in the Mid-Atlantic and the South Atlantic here in the US, was actually a megastar in the Philippines, greeted with the same intensity and frenzy as a band like the Beatles or the Carpenters for that matter. And the afternoon TV variety shows when I was growing up there, when she was on tour in 1982, a show called Student Canteen hosted for at least 2 hours every day an Angela Bofill sound-alike competition, including and focused on her song, This Time I'll Be Sweeter. And I'm just going to play this rather the dodgy quality of a video clip of Angela Bofill performing in Manila later than the 80s. Of course, this is closer to the early 2000s. And you can imagine, that basically an entire hour or two of afternoon variety show program was just taken up with different people, everyday Filipinos, singing an excerpt of this song like this time I'll be sweeter, and basically trying to win a cash prize and tickets to meet Angela Bofill and see her in concert. And I also want to just gesture briefly to the fact, and to kind of bring some symmetry to this, that in the year 2000, I believe it was the year, or maybe it was 2002, Angela Bofill actually performed with Christopher Cross, who opened my talk today. And part of what I was referring to as the kind of porousness to that sonic color line that Stover has theorized, you can see here, I'm just going to play the little part of the clip for you where Cross is introducing the musical personnel at the show at the Araneta Coliseum, which is a huge coliseum in Manila.
They've made it a pure joy for Kenny and Rex and Angela and I to do what we do and make us sound so good and allow us to play these songs for you. I want to introduce each one of them to you. On the drums, please welcome Nina Regalado, please. On percussion, Mike Alba. The funky man on the bass, Mr. Sonny Azarin. On guitar, my fellow picker, Cesar Aguas, please. On keyboards, Mr. Bon Sampson.
Okay, so you see here that all of the musical personnel is actually Filipino, right? So Christopher Cross did not tour or bring
Babsy
with him
Molina.
a band from the States, but in fact that put together an entire ensemble, including backup singers
and Mr. Don
of
Ramirez.
Filipino musicians and performers. And this is, of course, linked to the longer history of Filipino musical performers and performances being, at the heart of one of its kind of international exports. Stephanie Nung has written about this, Christine Belance and others. Okay. So, and then, I'm not going to go ahead and play Christopher Cross singing with Angela, because it's as much as I'd love, there she is coming out on stage, I'll keep it turned down, kind of watch them in the background. But for the sake of time, I'll just go ahead and move towards my conclusion here today. If I had extended time, I could dive into how the recording personnel, from production teams to session musicians, also cuts across and through what Stover has theorized as the sonic color line, kept intact by the backdated formats that I've otherwise discussed, especially yacht and spago rock. I could even get into how the trans-Pacific elements of what I'm talking about also had transatlantic iterations as the 80s wore on, with a nod to Arif Mardin's work with acts like Scritti Politti and Green Gartside's androgen blue-eyed soul vocals, which I could only describe as sous vide. But I would like to wind towards my conclusion by venturing an answer to why, and not just how, this music seduced listeners in the Asia-Pacific region, specifically in Southeast Asia, in sites of island and archipelagic tourism like the Philippines. Why, in other words, would white demi-acoustic melancholic expressions of reconstructed masculinity stir affinities in groups of people who are distinctly not of their privileged, presumptively yacht-owning, or at least catamaran-adjacent ilk? What is the affinity part, in other words? If soft rock and yacht rock in particular offer a sonic escape to Never Never Land, where you can get all caught up in the reverie, as Christopher Cross's Sailing promises, for whom is that escape possible? I would actually argue, in a cruelly optimistic way, that soft rock presents a different iteration of escape for the non-white listeners who have been hailed by its soft power. The escape is not from one's own melancholia fueled by failures both intimate and global, as it is for, say, white listeners unconsciously or consciously mourning lost colonial access and freedom. Instead, the soft rock resort canon presents an occasion to reframe the local inhabitants' experience of paradise, that site of everydayness, a site of arduous labor, especially for those working in the resort industry, to manufacture versions of paradise for tourists. And I like to think here a little bit of, the intertext of something like Mike White's recent limited series, I guess not limited anymore, White Lotus. This experience of paradise is a fantasy that the locals, in the end, realize they truly have dominion over. Something that is theirs, not the transient white visitor's last hope for finding himself. Paradise will be here before and after the bearded white dude's forays elsewhere, that are really forays into himself, into the affluent American psyche and what ails it. No, I'm not suggesting here that an affinity for this music comes from how it enables locals to inhabit a white gaze or a white ear, though there are elements of that in play. And I point to Vicente Rafael's classic work on white love and other events in Filipino history. But in much the same way that I argued in Why Karen Carpenter Matters, that Karen belongs to Filipinos, not the other way around, that we aren't just fans, followers, or cheerful colonial acolytes who have the power, cheerful colonial acolytes, but that we have the power to reanimate her, for better or worse, is our echo through our karaoke canons and otherwise. Our relationship to soft rock more broadly indexes the power paradise holds, one that can never truly be had or conquered. If soft rock is, as I argued, the kind of power that seduces, it begs to be asked whose assets produce the attraction that leads to acquiescence? Who truly wields the power when we're the ones who have this music on lock and who are used to transforming what we have, the little we've been given, into something far more remarkable than we ever dreamed it could be? And that is the end of the talk, but I want to leave you with a thematically appropriate song, Leave Me Alone Tonight. Okay, I'll fade out. Thank you very much.
Oh, minds are blown. Karen, thank you so much. What an extraordinary talk. I don't know if you noticed, but the chat was absolutely blowing up with connections and ideas and compliments and questions. What a remarkable way to get us started. So thank you so much. What a wonderful offering. So now let's pivot to our second speaker for the evening. With just a wealth of brilliance today. So I'm pleased to introduce Professor André Brock. André Brock is an associate professor of media studies at Georgia Tech. His scholarship examines racial representations in social media, video games, Black women in weblogs, whiteness and technoculture, including innovative and groundbreaking research on Black Twitter. Brock's important article, From the Black Hand Side, Twitter as a Cultural Conversation, challenged social science and communication research to confront the ways in which the field, in his words, preserved, quote, a colorblind perspective on online endeavors by normalizing whiteness and othering everyone else, end quote. And it sparked a conversation that continues, as Twitter in particular continues to evolve as a communication platform. Brock has also authored influential research on digital methods, gaming, blogging, and online identity. His NYU Press book titled Distributed Blackness, African American Cybercultures was published in February 2020. Offering insights to understanding Black everyday lives mediated by networked technologies. Distributed Blackness won the Popular Cultural Association's 2021 Harry Shaw and Katrina Hazard-Donald Award for outstanding work in African American popular cultural studies. Please join me in welcoming André Brock this evening.
I'm on video.
Welcome, André. We can hear you. Can't quite see you yet.
Yeah, my video is, I picked the right time to have technical difficulties. It was working just a minute ago. Oh, wait, let's go, come on. Not that y'all need to see me anyway, because I'm gonna share my screen, but you know, it would be nice. It says virtual background is still loading, so give me a second.
Sounds good. Oh, we can see your shared slides though.
Perfect. All right, so let me start running my mouth then. You can see my expression. So I do not have any music whatsoever. I'm so jealous right now. So thank you so much to Gail and Keith for inviting me to be part of this symposium. Also, shout out to Dr. Tongson for that dope presentation featuring music from my libidinally intense adolescence. I've just been transported. So today, I have some new stuff. I promised on Twitter that this presentation doesn't include anything about the Green Book, Kiki Palmer, or the unfortunately named hashtag Nigger Navy. Instead, I want to focus on the mundane conversations of Black Twitter. and even those that reach tenuring status, because they are often unremarked upon by the Academy. In part because the sheer volume of communication on the service is too large a data set for analysis, but also because heroism, resistance, and trauma overdetermine representations of Black folk offline and the Black digital. So this talk takes on a subset of banal Black Twitter discourses, which I am here naming as memory work, with the aim of illuminating how Black Twitter topics, discourse practices, and digital expertise evoke shared cultural histories and commonplaces. And this presentation will employ libidinal economy, which I'll try to explain, and critical technocultural discourse analysis, which I won't explain. And through this, I'm beginning to conduct an inquiry into how memory work functions through the technological mediation of social media and cultural discourses. So the Black everyday rarely makes it into archives. Tanya Sutherland powerfully argues that archives are instead sites for trauma and violence enacted against Black folk. In the meantime, social media has quickly accrued a negative connotation where the activities of the masses are rarely understood as worthy of archival capture or even as high culture. But the digital is an archive worth exploring, as these virtual spaces richly encapsulate how average folk argue for themselves and their own futures. While I see the digital as an archive, I also see it as a temporal space for Black enactment, the post-present. Thus, my interest in the banality of Black Twitter and other spaces where ratchet digital practice is enacted reinvest futurity into present uses of the digital rather than impossible cyborg or Black magical futures. In other words, Blackness is neither post-human, post-racial, nor interested in being so, even as it takes on futuristic practices of constructing themselves and their community. So memory work. I have on the slide a quote from Annette Kuhn, and she argues that an act of memory is in fact a series of activities, inscribing or recording, interpreting, narrating, recalling, etc., that may involve a number of memory products. And she references specifically pictures, albums, videos, film, and other media products. She argues that memory work is a conscious and purposeful staging of memory. So from this, I take that memory work as an active practice of remembering that takes an inquiring attitude toward the past and the activity of its reconstruction through memory. It involves a complex set of recursive activities that shape our inner worlds, allowing us to make sense of the world around us and construct an idea of continuity between self and others. Lee Humphreys, in their analysis of Snapchat, notes that memory work highlights the ways that people purposefully and strategically create media traces to help them remember events and experiences in their lives within particular narratives of the self, the social context, for example, the family or romantic partner, and the broader cultural environment. So let me give you my example of where memory work happens in my work. I've argued for Black Twitter as a mediation of the Black discursive practice of signifying. For those not in the know, signifying is a moment of discursive practice where the interlocutor inventively redefines an object, person, or phenomenon using Black cultural commonplaces and philosophy. Henry Louis Gates describes this as breaking the chain of signifiers. I also argue for Black Twitter digital practice as signifying, marking a generative, stylistic relationship between code, community, and content. And in doing so, Black Twitter digital practice vivifies the non-communicability of Blackness in the West into an agentive mediation or mediatization of Black life and thought. From this perspective, code, digital discourse, and language as culture can and do constitute racial identity. The digital mediates Blackness in ways that allow for Black sociality despite commodification, capture, surveillance, or control. Twitter's affordance then of Black interiority through the practice of Twitter's initial prompt, "What are you doing today?" offers articulations of the everyday and yields the Black banal and the everyday as art, or politics, but its value for memory work lies in the process, practice, and repetition of unalloyed libidinal expressions of joy and catharsis arising from interactions with the service, with others, and with institutions. But culture is apprehensive of repetition, even as we are aware that novelty is inexhaustible thanks to the finite supply of signs and the need for recognition and human understanding. I think I got that quote wrong. Nevertheless, culture must maintain a sense of continuity about itself in order to exist. As Hegel and others have defined that need for continuity as stasis, arguing for it as pre-modern, I feel comfortable claiming that the West prefers to believe that culture should not repeat. And if you're a gamer or a film critic, you'll know that one of the quickest and most easily applied criticism of any media object is, I've seen this before, right? That under modernity, culture and people must grow and develop or progress. And I argue that this is where our libidinal tensions about the digital as innovation, disruption, and progress arise. Personal memory as a cultural phenomenon encompasses activities and products of memory. Van Dijk refers to mediated memories and says they play an important part in the construction of individual and collective identity at the intersection of groups, individuals, and culture. They are creative acts of cultural production and collection through which people make sense of their own lives and their connections to the lives of others, right? But it is beyond this, personal memory is beyond but not distinct from the individual, however. It is not necessarily divided by the private or public or bounded by the nation state. Social memory then is taken to include aspects of culture as well as social practices and structures, and it is produced in the interstitial space between individuals who remember and social groups who recall, and are being communicated in time and across time by media technologies and cultural forms. So in the last part of Distributed Blackness, I talk a little bit about time, space, and Black culture. And I argue for something called the Black post-present. And I say that Black digital practitioners enact their cultural identity in the interstitial spaces of commercial platforms, where they not only seek the communal presence of others like them in the racialized, institutional, and technological desert of the real, they also transcend time and space in doing so by communicating with distant others to represent themselves in the now, in the past, and in the future. To establish the historical character of Black culture, to bring Africa and its subjects into history denied by Hegel and others, it has been necessary to assemble counter memories that contest the colonial archive, thereby situating the collective trauma of slavery as the founding moment of modernity. And this is from Kodwo Ishan's discussion of Afrofuturism, right? He goes on to say that the field of Afrofuturism does not seek to deny the tradition of counter memory. Rather, it aims to extend that tradition by reorienting the intercultural vectors of Black Atlantic temporality towards the proleptic as much as the retrospective. But I recently published an article called Black Technoculture and as Afrofuturism, where I argue that Black technoculture is a complement to Afrofuturism, even as I criticize Afrofuturism, the theory. And I say that whereas Afrofuturism seems preoccupied with reimagining a future history of Blackness and technology, often utopian, but occasionally, if you think of Parable of the Sower, dystopian as well, Black cyberculture as a futuristic practice is better argued for as the post-present, particularly as it is constructed and contested through Black cultural digital spaces and discourses. By post-present, I mean that Black folk and digital spaces are constantly engaged with the moment, or kairos. Black kairos, then, is simultaneously racial performance or enactment, discursive invention, and appropriate, timely engagement within a communicative and cultural context. It invests energies into, in doing so, it invests energies into being, a celebration of the now that incorporates past inequities, present joys, and future imaginings. Black kairos, particularly as enacted across social media, such as Snapchat, but also more spaces where the olds like me congregate, such as Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, right, also offers a social rearrangement of time and space. Consider the term on red. Now, in verbal discussions, my Generation X ears insisted on hearing it as unread, in part because I'm a Southerner, so it's vocalized through a Southern accent, which when considered as an element of interactivity in computer-mediated communication, signals that one, the reader has activated the read-receive function of their messaging client, allowing them to know whether the recipient has received the message, and two, that the recipient's client app has received the message, but the recipient has not viewed it. What I have learned about the term, however, is much more inventive. When you get a message and leave it on read, it is a signal that that you have received and viewed the message, but has deliberately not responded. Because if you think about it, your notification banner, if you have your security settings set up appropriately, will, when you glance at your phone, show you the beginning content of the message without marking it as having been read, right? So this action deposits the sender in a temporal, a textual, and a virtual purgatory, left unsure as to whether they will receive a response. More sinisterly, the sender is also recast semiotically through text and sociality as to whether they are indeed a member of the recipient's communicative network. Somebody in the chat just talked about email, and I definitely leave my email on read and unread. So I've talked a little bit about libidinal economy. Let me briefly try to explain this complicated conceptual and theoretical framework. For me, drawing from Barth and Lyotard, libidinal economy makes clear the affective tensions undergirding modernity and Western technoculture. It also provides me a path towards conceptualizing Black technology use as a space for mundanity, banality, and the celebration of making it through another day. I encountered libidinal economy through Afro-pessimism, but I'm not an Afro-pessimist. Instead, I argue for Afro-optimism, which argues that Blackness goes above and beyond social death, or the negation of sociality and humanity that modernity would have us believe is the plight of Black folks. Instead, Afro-optimism is a celebration of the capacity of Black thought. Think of it as an excess of life, helping us navigate the anti-Blackness and racisms of everyday life as Black folk moving through the world. Libidinal economy and this formulation as an excess of life expands my inquiry into the Black digital and social media practice from productivity and efficiency, or political economy's interest in commodification, to incorporate analyses of Black digital practice engendered by joy, sexuality, playfulness, anger, and occasionally politics. In doing so, Afro-optimism sees Blackness as a discourse and conversation with, but not wholly subject to, white supremacist ideology, and along the way, a refutation of the categorical nature of white supremacist ideology and capitalist identity. In other words, we refuse to be confined to a stereotype. The libidinal is integral to cultural context. It is the value-laden tension underlying the beliefs within which we operate, where we operate. It is infrastructure, invisible to our perceptions, just like the materials and processes we pass by, like curb cuts on the sidewalk, or whether or not you have clean, potable running water, or utilize every day until a rupture occurs. Like Ahmed, I argue that the libidinal illuminates social imaginaries while also undergirding social realities. I'd add, though, that the libidinal is neither precognition nor pre-intention. Instead, it can be understood as the combustion powering the engine, a visceral, powerful, and necessary component in any figuration of social or cultural practices and institutions. So let me get to some examples. There's a constant productive tension between our inclination to mark significant events and the cultural frameworks through which we recall them. Cultural acts of memory thus imply common knowledge of social conventions, like, say, the norms of selfies, right? As well as habitual knowledge of technological aids, such as filters, angles to hold your face in. Remember the MySpace angle, right? Or even bandwidth. I have found that screenshots have become our digital receipts, serving as captures of banal and also momentous phenomena for later recall and retrieval. In my own personal practice, I have long captured screenshots of recipes and online payment transactions, especially for the last, as emails can disappear and printed pages often get buried under other mail and other printed pages. So I mentioned Black Kairos earlier, right? And so here I'm adding an additional layer to it, where Black Kairos also refers to the archival capacities afforded to Black discourse by social media platforms, digital and multimedia practices, communal structures, and the instantaneity afforded by information networks, right? And just to expand upon that a moment, I often ask my students, what's a selfie, right? And they are usually heavily intent on convincing me that a selfie is any photograph you take of yourself or that someone takes of you. And I always push back, because I am aware from my own flawed practice in selfie taking, but also I have daughters, that the selfie is the one picture you post to your social network, right? It's not a picture in a photo album on Flickr, right? It's not the photos that you have that you get back on the CD. Oh, does anybody still do that anymore? From Walmart or Meijer or Fred, what's the name of your grocery store out there that still does photo processing? Walgreens, right? It's neither of those things, right? It is posted to a social media platform. It is a digital multimedia practice, but importantly, it has a communal structure and distribution and instantaneity afforded by information networks. Just to keep this libidinal, because I would hate to let you go without me at least talking out the side of my neck, right? One of the things that my timeline often talks about is old nude pictures, right? The guys complain, like, I've seen that before, where the women are like, you're lucky to even get that one, right? But that idea, right, that picture, that selfie, right, which requires extensive wardrobe, environmental, even attitudinal adjustments in order to create a seductive photo, right, is something that is understood to be shared, yet also demanded to be new and innovative and progressive, right? Same thing with selfies, right? So I decided to pick up on one example of digital receipts, and I call this showing the receipts, right? As one Black post-present discursive digital practice that situates past transgressive behavior, often recorded in the form, oh wait, should I even say that right now? That'll be fine. If you have it again. Oh, let me just do this example first, and then I'll come back to that example. Then I'll come back to this text. Let me know if you can hear this. Go back. Oh, I can't hear. Maybe you can read the subtitles. Boo, we're supposed to have audio. Maybe I should have practiced this particular slide so I could have been fly. Oh no, what'd I do? There we go.
On the kind of America you live in. I'd go to Best Buy and give a dude some straightening. Straighten his ass out. Yeah. I'm straightening. Dude at Best Buy gonna decide I don't need a bag with my purchase. You just have an iPhone case. I figure you could just pop that open. No, I ain't popping shit. You put it in the bag. I need that in a bag. What do you need a bag for? I understand what you need a bag. It's wasteful, recycle. Don't you care about the earth? I go, sir, this has nothing to do with the earth. I'm a black man in America. I gotta leave this store with a bag, bruh. It's about safety. I'm black. I don't get the luxury of just walking out with shit in my hand. That is a roll of the dice. That is a horrifying day. If I would have known, not only do I need that bag, bitch, I need that receipt and staple it to the outside. I don't want a receipt in my hand. You staple my receipt to the outside like Chinese carryout, and I hold it up in the air. I Lion King, I Hakuna Matata, an iPhone case out of Best Buy. And it's not his fault. He just didn't understand. He thought he was saving the earth, but he was saving a life. That's what he was doing. This has nothing to do with recycling, man. Because see, you might be a cool person. The cashier might be a cool ass dude, but we don't know what the security guard had been through up front. I come prancing out of Best Buy with this naked ass iPhone case in my hand. And here comes security. Excuse me, sir. Did you pay for that? Oh yeah, I got the receipt. He going for a gun. Stop out. Freedom.
As we can see from that testimonial video, showing the receipts is one Black post-present discursive, digital, and physical practice, where Roy Wood Jr. compellingly argues that his possession of a receipt affords him safety and peace of mind, shielding him from accusations of theft or the possibility of police aggression. I found a more recent form of the receipts that situates and publishes past transgressive behavior, often recorded in the form of digitized documents, but occasionally in visual multimedia testimony in the now, usually via social media, to be read as evidence or a receipt in the moment. And the phrase, "show me the receipts," was read into recent cultural memory from a 2002 Whitney Houston interview with Diane Sawyer. After being confronted about the amount of money that she allegedly spent on drugs, Houston heatedly said, "I want to see the receipts." And Houston's words were grounded in a refusal to be shamed by unconfirmed information. And this phrase has since taken on a wider meaning for holding the political accountable. Now, I've argued elsewhere that showing the receipts has a much longer history, that of resistance against Reconstruction era voting disenfranchisement. Many state and local governments, not just in the South, because I had another image different from the one on the screen from Washington state dated in 1890, right? Following the emancipation of the enslaved, implemented a poll tax to dissuade Black voters and poor whites who often couldn't afford the financial burden of being part of the country's political process. Not all Blacks were impoverished though, and those who did pay made sure to retain a copy of the poll tax receipt in order to continue exercising their right to vote. While I originate this in the Reconstruction, you may notice that the image I have on screen is dated 1954, leading me to argue that Whitney was actually referencing an older practice rather than creating a new one. So that's one version of showing the receipts. This is another one. Once upon a time, I went viral. I was fascinated by an increasingly popular digital practice, and my recasting of that practice within a cult favorite television show as a Black archival and discursive tradition resonated with a lot of people. Van Dyck would call these mediated memories, but mediation doesn't do enough to describe the interactions and libidinal intensities of this particular practice. We inscribe experiences in the present to facilitate future recall. Such material inscriptions are always filtered. That would be bad. Is that better? Chat window. Ha. Okay. Such material inscriptions are always filtered through discursive conventions, social and cultural practices. Consider these evocations of memory works as the articulation of futures and histories within the everyday digital forms of the mainstream of Black vernacular expression. As such, I endorse Van Dijk's claim that the act of remembering is necessarily an activity inscribed in time, often fostered by an urgency to save a sense of the present as the future's past. Cultural memory links the past to the present and future, but as an activity taking place in the present, the past is continually modified and revised, even as it continues to shape the future. So me calling out this you I'm arguing for as Black Twitter memory work, right, is the practice of publishing and captioning quote tweets, often featuring either older tweets or screenshots. And these quote tweets are meant as both recollection of and retribution against out of pocket, inappropriate, or contradictory behavior. And when the phenomena is libidinally engaging, may often go viral. While it may seem carceral, and in many cases, it's been taken to be emblematic of cancel culture, it is also a moment of humor, but not necessarily shaming to the audience witnessing the comeuppance. And in doing so, Black Twitter memory workers illuminate Twitter's capacity as a fixed, permeable, yet ephemeral cultural archive. I mentioned the ephemeral in part because of Snapchat, but specifically to Twitter, occasionally those being called out through this you call out practice will temporarily suspend their account, thus rendering the original post unavailable and generating the tweets aren't loading right now screen. This activity allows for the possibility of understanding memory work as not just remembrance, but also as kairos. Moreover, Twitter's capacity for restricting access to the archive suggests possibilities for community and individual control over curation, rather than simply the platform's content moderation capacity to remove objectionable content. One more, hopefully I still have time. So Twitter the service can itself be understood as a space for rhetorical invention, rather than simply a service for rote information transmission, but also for the lost art of mnemonics, and signifying benefits from this affordance, providing Twitter with an alternative reason to be, the performance of wordplay through joy, drama, and catharsis, ritualized in a rigid format as a discursive style that demands attention on a digital platform, offering the distributed enactment of Blackness across time and space. I call this dispersive style signifying, but there are multiple meanings to that term. And here, signifying should be understood not as the dozens, but as a dispersal of meaning across time, rather than just a deciphering, where the audience gains control, yet doesn't respect the original post or the authorial intent. And this leads to experimentation, the creation of new relationships between sign and signifier, and the treatment of discourses as unfinished and ruptured. Let me show you. Here's an example of memory work as repetition, experimentation, dispersal, and rupture. In 2019, the used to be popular rapper T.I., named Clifford Harris, came under fire because he proudly declared that he stood by in the examining room while his daughter's gynecologist examined his daughter's hymen to determine whether she was still a virgin. Black Twitter would not let that go unpunished. And so here, quote tweets, right, will be used to parody his misunderstanding of female anatomy and his carceral intentions towards his daughter's sexual agency by signifying on meanings of the word hymen. So the original tweet I could not capture. Remember I said that sometimes people take down their account or suspend it so that you can't find the original tweet? That's what happened to the original tweet, which was posted by a young lady whose Twitter name is OMG. And first she asked, how y'all's hymen doing today? And then when somebody responded, what's a hymen, right? She then set off this particular mimetic practice, saying that a hymen is a spiritual song sung during church or praise, right? And this began a landslide, a moment that probably will be one of the top 10 Black Twitter moments ever. And so I'll show you why. These tweets, building upon one another by repeating and deliberately, inventively misunderstanding and redefining each preceding reference, are a sparkling example of Black Twitter wit and creativity in a tightly constrained format, which was formerly only possible in cloistered spaces such as barbershops and beauty salons. There's more. Because Twitter users of all races enjoy wordplay and memes, This phenomena quickly spread beyond the confines of Black Twitter, but I'm comfortable in arguing for the meme's origination within Black Twitter as a form of Black Twitter memory work, where the memory is joyfully reconfigured across time to signal Black belonging. So, Black technoculture and cyberculture highlights the possibilities of futurity and remembrance inherent in the vivification of everyday life, which is often grimy and sometimes banal, that's offered by Black sociality, subjectivity, and digital practice. In capturing the contributions of regular folk, thinking through their own engagements with technology's promises and failures, Black technoculture highlights the possibilities of futurity. Oops, I said that already. All right. Highlights the possibilities of futurity. These creases, these interstices, where these interesting, unintended media phenomena happen, allow us to see and capture the contributions of regular folk thinking through their own engagements with technology, with life, and with culture. Thank you.
Yay! That was so amazing. Both talks, just fantastic. Thank you so much, Karen and Andre. Andre, in this next little bit, I'm going to do some more introductions, but please try to get your camera working. We would love to see you. Yes, but you got some time, so don't, no rush. Take your time. Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce Keats and my two phenomenal co-editors, Ra Malaika Imhotep and Rashad Timmons, who will be kicking off the opening round of questions to our speakers. While they converse with Karen and Andre, please put your questions, I'm addressing the whole audience now, please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. In a few minutes, the editors will, all the editors will come in and we will read questions from the Q&A box aloud to the speakers. Okay, so the next editor I would like to introduce is Ra Malaika Imhotep. Malaika is a Black feminist writer and performance artist from Atlanta, Georgia, currently completing a PhD in African diaspora studies and new media studies at the University of California, Berkeley. As a scholar and cultural worker, Malaika is invested in exploring relationships between queer Black femininities, Black vernacular cultures, and the performance of labor. As a steward of Black studies and Black feminist thought, Malaika dreams, organizes, and facilitates spaces of critical reflection and embodied spiritual political education. Malaika is co-author of the Black Feminist Study Theory Atlas, and their debut poetry collection is being published by Red Hen Press next month. And the next editor I'd like to introduce is Rashad Timmons. Rashad graduated from Michigan State University with a BA and MA in journalism, specializing in African American and African studies. His work broadly explores Black being and participation in online communities. More specifically, he's interested in how digital performances of Blackness trouble subjective embodiment and disrupt spatial, temporal logics of being. So now I'm going to hand it over to Malaika and Rashad and our speakers so they can have a conversation. Yes, Andre, perfect timing. All right, I'm going away.
Thank you so much, Gail. I'm so honored to be here and so excited. It's such a hard time to be alive. And I think it's a high blessing to get to like breathe and think with you all today. So thank you all, Dr. Brock and Dr. Tongson for just breathing into us in such beautifully inspirited ways. Rashad, I love how we're both kind of like in the neo-soul media crease today. In that repetition and that haunting, which I probably owe a lot of my personality to. But I don't know, like Rashad, do you have a preference for like how we start?
Nah, I'm vibing. I also am, super excited to be here and be present with y'all. I did not know that I was coming to talk about my two great loves, right? Music and Black Twitter. I just feel really honored and grateful to be having discussions about things that like move and affect me in an everyday valence, in addition to being sites where my intellectual and like academic pursuits often reside too. So Yeah, I don't have any preference. We can just kick it and talk. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll start with a question that I hope will kind of just like bring you to in conversation together. It's really hard to know where to start. I'm like flipping through my notes. But the first question I've written down is, I'm noticing through both your presentations that you all call theory from these like mundane but very intimate facets of life that I imagine are kind of like personal, like what Octavia Butler might call positive obsessions for both of you, whether that's like soft rock or Black Twitter. And I'm wondering if you might share what are the stakes and pleasures of bringing those kind of like close personal objects of enjoyment into academic discourse.
I mean, I can start because I think, you know, most of my work, you know, it starts from more grandiose places conceptually, but it always ends up, I don't want to say lapsing, but just like it ends up tapping into what it is that has been ubiquitous in my experience and in my life. I went to Berkeley for grad school in the English department, and I was trained as a new historicist. But for me, I couldn't quite properly execute that. And I will put that ASAP J article in the mix because it talks about that experience. I wasn't especially, or at least I didn't think I was especially adept at the forms of historicizing things that felt more distant or remote, like 19th century British literature and culture, which was what I was being trained in at the time as a graduate student. But, you know, I put that level of intensity and focus always in the things that interested me as a person. We could call it fandom in certain respects, but it's not like I was a fan of Karen Carpenter or that I'm necessarily a fan of Christopher Cross or anything. I just notice the excitement and forms of fandom and the kind of affect that spills over around these objects. So I guess for me, it was about understanding how to do that kind of deep genealogical and historical engagement, to accept the way that I do that kind of deep historical and genealogical engagement instead of trying to shoehorn the, you know, like what I was doing with certain objects. Because I think that, and this is where I'll hand it over to André, I think that where many of us fail as scholars is in imagining that somehow we have to produce objects that are more dignified or that will be acceptable. And I think, and we see how that works in academic hierarchies, in the distribution of resources, funding, fellowships. You know how hard it is to get an external fellowship working on a project about karaoke, right? But what one is saying, what one is saying about these things taps into the very heart of the problems that we were all concerned with: imperialism, violence, colonialism, et cetera, and also taps into the importance of joy and affect and creativity and transformation. So I guess, you know, that's a roundabout way of answering that. I think that it's a matter of, I do think that it's a matter of accepting one's object choices and not indicating the elevated value of other objects over your own.
So for me, I'd add that we are often, as academics of color, accused of doing me search, right? Where we're speaking ourselves into existence through our acquisition and deployment of theory, method, and discipline, right? And I don't see the problem with it because I see that BIPOC scholars do it all the time. But also, I had my objects of positive obsession long before I came to libidinal economy. I'd been writing about the digital for 7 or 8 years before I got to Twitter. I've written about games and blogs and shit stuff like that, right? But libidinal economy, especially as I took it up after my Twitter article was published, afforded me a way to argue for Blackness not as simply an encounter with racism, right? It afforded me the possibilities to talk about, as I mentioned in the talk, being Afro-optimistic, talking about joy and pleasure as rationales for technology use, right? So I often say that Black folk are not necessarily interested in information technologies capacities to be productive and efficient, right? So I had a slide that I took out where I talked about Kanye West, Kanye when he still had a mama, not this Kanye, right? But he talking about, I might be late, but I'm always on time, right? And that to me is a really signal way of understanding a differential relationship with time and space that Black folk have, and that I saw, especially once I applied libidinal economy instead of political economy, right? I saw that in Black Twitter and other spaces, right? And so I think that's kind of my answer to your question, right? I was able to bring this sophisticated, complicated theoretical construct to bear on what Black people do on the digital, in part because of the illumination of Blackness that it affords, right? That it shows from the bottom that what we do is not beholden to the Enlightenment or to modernity, but instead it's our own thing, our own rhythm repetition, right? And that was really important to me to talk about what me, but also the people who look like me do when we get in these digital spaces. It's not play. It's not, we don't know what to do. It's not that we can't afford it. We have our own thing. And so that's how I ended up where I am.
Yeah. Thank you both so much. Before I pass the mic to Rashad, I just want to take a moment to really acknowledge the way that the Berkeley Center for New Media, the Color of New Media Working Group, and classes a class I took with Gail DeCosnick my first year really opened that up to me. This idea that the objects that were most close to me, that I was most excited about or curious about, were worthy objects of intellectual inquiry. And I think that really shifted in the most meaningful way my academic trajectory and potential career. So I'm just so grateful for the work that's done in this space. And it feels very fitting to be in this conversation and in this work of the symposium and of the book project as in my final year of grad school. So just wanted to show some praise to BCNM in the work in the leadership of Gail DeCosnick.
I second that all the way. Yeah. I also took a seminar with Gail DeCosnick my first semester that made me realize the stuff that I wanted to write about was righteous and legitimate, and that the things that struck and affected me deeply could also be sacred and worthy of intellectual inquiry. I really think that you all's answers and that question, Ra, is so beautiful. I feel like I've been actually talking about creases. I feel like this is a conversation I've been having a lot lately. I was talking with a colleague of mine recently about Zora Neale Hurston and how so much of her body of work is just her writing love letters to a community in Edenville, Florida that she loves so deeply and dearly. And I feel like that is quite the same experience that I had feeling and thinking my way through y'all's work, right? Dr. Tongson, I was so moved trying to grapple with what it meant for you to be writing about what you talk about as your namesake, coming from a family of musicians, relocating from the Philippines to a place in California, right, that is just outside of where Karen Carpenter lived. And then Dr. Brock, I feel like what I love most about your work is that I can envision you geeking out about the things that you study so deeply, right? That we can sit here and talk for hours about on red, right? As a Black communicative practice, right? As the ways that Black folks signify code and content. So yeah, such a beautiful question and something that I'm meditating on and sitting with. In the line of like continuing with this conversation about affect, one of the things that I know I think about a lot in my own work, and is something that we talk about in BCNM and that I see palpable in both of y'all's writing, is trying to think through the relationship between affect and infrastructure. I think that's a like really important question to me. And yeah, it's something that I'm hoping that I can ask you both to talk a bit more about. Specifically, Dr. Tongson, I found it so riveting to think about the radio like as a mediating infrastructure of soft rock and soft power in the Philippines, and to think about the centrality, the importance of like radio broadcast infrastructures to that dynamic and power relation. And then for you, Dr. Brock, thinking about the ways that Black folks in the everyday stylize code and content, and how Black folks kind of unsettle the digital infrastructure of Twitter. I would love for you both to talk more about those things and how you see infrastructure and affect kind of working together in your academic writing.
Did you want to go first this time, André?
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. So I tend to run away from the affect, in part because I remember reading in Masumi that affect is outside of culture, and I have a huge difficulty conceiving of that, right? So instead, I turn to Barth and Leotard, and I should add Raymond Williams in there as well, structures of feeling, right? But also Afro-pessimism, right? Which is, as I said in the presentation, that's how I encountered libidinal economy in the first place. The arrangement of desires, feelings, intensities, pleasures, hatreds, passion, and the like. And to me, that clearly is invested in any technical and technological object, but almost anything that we have created a sign with which to communicate our perception of that thing to other people, right? And so that's why I say the libidinal is, and I guess I'm substituting for for affect here, but the libidinal is not precognition, right? It's really just the visceral reaction to the things that you may have observed or even pre-observed. So I talk about often the prickling on the back of your neck when you feel in danger, right? For me, the key for me beyond affect, and Ahmed talks about affective economies, I prefer libidinal economies, in part because Leotard hit upon something for me that Ahmed did not. And he talked about how do you understand in a society structured around political, economic exchange, right? Things which cannot be exchanged, right? So my canonical example is Facebook. And it tried to define what a friend was by saying it's a mechanical process where you recognize a friend and that friend recognizes you and you agree that you have a relationship. So we will afford you access to each other's posts, right? But the problem with that mechanical definition is that friend is so much more complicated. Like there's FWBs, there's associates, there's work buddies, there's acquaintances, there's your parents. I once told my mother when she tried to friend me on Facebook, I said, you told me you wasn't my little friend. So that really kind of put a dent in our relationship, but that made perfect sense to me, right? And so for me, the libidinal is infrastructure, right? Any infrastructure cannot be understood without it. I'm really starting to dig into human geography, and it said, and one of the things I came across said that without people, infrastructure is just ruins. Right, which is really fascinating to me too, right? Because although we talk a lot about algorithms and machines talking to other machines and machine intelligence, people created those things, right? People are expected to interact with those things. Those things are also expected to interact on people, right? And so to me, if you bring people into the equation, as Heidegger would ask us to do, right, then you also have to account for their libidinal, visceral responses and interpolations of self and anything that they do. So I'll stop there because I'm getting crazy with it. But Karen, what you got?
Well, I think I wanted to start actually from a place of where the language of infrastructure, for example, is one that I've seen emerging, in fact, in my advising, right? And the framework of infrastructure is one that I've seen emerge in my advising in the last I want to say 5 to 7 years, right? And it's one that I've had to sort of catch up to understand why the term infrastructure became the thing that replaced what in my late 90s graduate education and, coming into the career of that moment replaced something like networks or discourse network or, the discursive, right? Because as a scholar of culture, those were the terms that I was used to kind of describing what many people are using to describe the kind of infrastructural, even though infrastructure obviously is one that emerges because of our need to be more descriptive of technologies and the kind of technological practices and platforms that have replaced what we think of as, the Kitlerian discourse network or print culture or sound or, even like the radio, right, as a network, right? I've talked about Armed Forces Radio as a network. So I think that and that's maybe part of the distinction between, just to get back to something in the talk a little bit, a phrase like cultural imperialism, which functions through state apparatuses, bureaucracies, education, in ways that, the building of culture is administered or managed through bureaucracy, right? Versus soft power, which actually is about capitalist circulation. It is about the kind of infiltration of the art commodity or the, kind of cultural commodity into the hearts and minds of people, right? And that's where affect then comes into the picture. My relationship to affect is and the term affect, I do love the libidinal though, and what it accomplishes, because I do think that, I see them as working kind of in tandem, and affect having maybe achieved a kind of canonicity now, but the reason that I think I remain attached to this affect as a term or as an idea, in much the same way there's a kind of temporal drag to my relationship to networks, et cetera, is that, I always think of affect as a kind of organizing node in queer discourse in particular, especially around the formation of norms in US culture and kind of the entire kind of Lauren Berlant oeuvre that is so profoundly informs my relationship to cultural work and objects. So when I think about, for example, what the functions of, let's say, soft rock in producing or creating or addressing norms versus their aberrant uses and the kind of other, like, I suppose, errant feelings that get activated by them in these other sites. That's kind of what I'm trying to work through. And those are the sort of systems that I am, sort of most familiar with, in particular, again, through that particular queer theoretical tradition that, establishes affect as at once the kind of world building glue, right? But also as the source of, let's say, sentimental manipulation in the nation state, right? So this is kind of like that ambivalence, that toggle is where I find myself kind of operating. So, but I do really appreciate and obviously, this is the thing about learning from one's students and younger peers and what have you, is that you cannot continue to necessarily be entrenched in your vocabularies, keywords, and terminologies. You have to kind of think about how these things evolve and when and why we apply certain terms over others.
Thank y'all so much. That's, yeah. I'm like reeling over here and like scribbling in my thing. Trying to take all the insights and make sure I'm annotating them so I can have some receipts.
All right. Well, thank you, Malika and Rashad, for such generative questions. That was a really great beginning to the Q&A. And now we're going to turn to the audience. And well, first of all, let me just say how good this event feels. It just feels really good to have this kind of scholarship, these types of conversations. I feel as somebody who, like all of us who study the popular and who try to put that in conversation with the post-colonial, the queer, disability, immigration statuses, and other races and ethnicities besides the white, besides the dominant, I think all of us have felt real marginalization at times in the US Academy, a real sense, like there's been many times that probably all of us have been in a room where, the general tone is that our work is ridiculous and, meaningless. So it's so great. It feels so good to have this conversation and these wonderful presentations tonight. And I feel like, like 21-year-old Gail taking the one course that was ever offered at Stanford in popular culture that I had to get up to make like an 8 a.m. Friday morning class in my very last quarter of college. Like, that person is really excited and happy and grateful about tonight. Because like all these years later, and like that type of work is thriving, and this feels really great. I feel like we're all going to be just like working through these concepts and ideas you presented to us for a long time to come. So, all right, with that, I might see if Laura and Sophia can promote some of these question askers to panelists. Could we have Vicente, are you around? You don't have to unmute your video, maybe you could just be on audio, or you could be on video if Laura or Sophia can promote you. And Vicente's question is about sound culture, it's about sound studies and the work. So let's see if we can
Let's see, can folks hear me? Wonderful.
Yeah.
I kind of had a question because I'm trying to work through this idea of the media crease showing up in the sonic world. And so I'm wondering, especially as we talked a little bit about music today and Black Twitter and clapbacks and receipts and all these different words that to me signal sonic things. I'm wondering how you see the concept of the media crease showing up in the sonic world for you. Is the crease a listening practice? Is it about making sounds? Is it a sound? Is the crease a musical product? And so like, how does the idea of the sonic and the media crease showing up in the sonic world, how does that idea resonate within your work?
I mean, I can answer really quickly insofar as, what struck me in Gail's description of what is accomplished by a media crease around persistence and repeated use over time makes me think of the concept of the echo, right? Which is one of the kind of source, like Bart's Echo of the Subject is one of the, like kind of my core or source text for thinking about sound and, the sonic beyond the technological, though it also certainly applies to the technological as well. So the media crease is, I think, in the sonic, like you can see the sonic itself enacting that. So when I talk about the stubborn persistence of a song in a repertoire, in a karaoke repertoire, or in a kind of DJ set list, or what have you, the kind of the stubborn, the stubborn persistence of this cultural text, that's what you're seeing is a kind of sonic expression of the media crease. And it happens, I think, in a lot of different sides of the world. I sort of wanted to bring in how taste culture actually delimits for us what counts as relevant or contemporary in a given moment. And so many cultural contexts and the kind of vestigial remnants of these cultural texts that are still listened to, that aren't supposed to be listened to anymore, what have you, are often thought to devalue that engagement. And I think that there's a way in how we observe that process as a kind of expression of this notion of the crease. So I think I'll stop there for now. And it does have to do with temporality. It does have to do with that concept of being freighted by, an association of pastness or past or overdueness. So yeah, I'll stop there.
If I can add to this, music is not my field of study, but I've come across a couple of things that are really interesting, which can talk to music and the crease. And when I think crease, I also think of that sharp break in the khaki pant that was created by the iron, right? And from there, I get led to the idea of the cut, right? Specifically, referring to the way certain musical genres employ the cut, like jazz, but particularly hip hop, right? And so there's cutting and scratching specifically referring to, right? But I love the way Dan Charnas's recent book talks about Dilla time. And he talks about Dilla time as a particular production style, which doesn't keep the beat in the groove. It's not in the cut, right? It's constantly slightly in a mode of slippage back and forth around that beat structure, right? In a way that sounds like it should not be rhythmic, but it actually is, right? And that idea of rhythm to me is important when I'm thinking through what a media crease is. And that's why repetition ended up making it back into my presentation. I came across this article from a million years ago by John Sneed called Repetition as Black Culture. Right. See, Abigail knows. Right. And Sneed is the one who reoriented me to the cut, but he wasn't necessarily talking about hip hop. He did kind of keep his focus on jazz and other spaces, Afrofuturism as well. Right. But again, that idea of the cut as or the media crease as a break in modern continuity, right? That's why that phrase made it into my presentation, that modern Western culture does not value repetition because it somehow sees it as stasis. But for people who inhabit the crease, that cut is a space where they can inhabit themselves, where they can be themselves apart from the overwhelming eye of mainstream society. And so media creases speak to that as well. So Black Twitter is absolutely a media crease. Right? That is not what Twitter was designed for. Although I would argue Twitter was designed to be banal from jump. It wasn't that, it was geek banality, right? What type of dongle do you use for your MacBook, right? What did you see at South by Southwest? It wasn't Black banality. So this U was never conceived, or the hashtags MCM or WCW, Man Crush Monday, or Woman Crush Wednesday. None of those things were ever perceived, but in taking over the cut and making it distinctively cultural, right? That they created a media crease of their own. And so that I'm moving back and forth between media text and musical cut and media crease, but I think they all have some similarity, because I would argue, and I want you to fight me, that Black culture is about repetition, right? As a cyclical way of centering itself in the cycle of seasons, rather than modernity's relentless march towards progress that's built on the bodies of our ancestors. Instead, we return to circularity and repetition as a way to recenter ourselves within the worlds we inhabit, something that modernity is not comfortable doing and never will be. And so for me, the media crease is really important in that way as well.
Such a rich conversation, and there's a question from someone in the audience that sort of begins to build and deepen on this, and it's from Amina. And Amina, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share out your question.
Absolutely. And first of all, thank you for this. I have so many sort of thoughts swirling around, and I just absolutely loved, Dr. Brock, when you reminded us of Whitney Houston, and then Angela Bofield is like singing in my head, Dr. Tongson. So this is for the Generation Xers. You know, I'm living for this moment, for this talk. But I've been thinking a lot about what Dr. Brock in your presentation, especially as you were talking about memory work, as you were describing that, and the relationship between memory, libidinal economy, and repetition in the media crease, particularly as we kind of think about like this idea of having receipts as a way of like proving that, you know, this thing did happen, and I'm repeating it by kind of sharing, you know, this documentation of proof that it did occur. And so like making memory something as provable. So I wanted you to talk a little bit more about kind of the connections between the crease and repetition and the nature of receipts and how you think about that.
Andre, you're muted.
Start over. I think I mentioned during the presentation and perhaps during my rambling answers in the Q&A that for me, libidinal economy affords me the capacity to see past libidinal beliefs in productivity and efficiency, right? So what is the productive use of a phrase, a two-word phrase, this you, and a quote tweet, right? It is absolutely a libidinal moment meant to both include, but also exclude certain people from a collective, right? And so for me, that usurpation, right, of Twitter's perceived progressive moments, I mean, perceived moments of progress and disruption, right? Disruption in a financialization sense, disruption in the sense that it changes our relationship to space and time is recentered through repetition, right? It's taking an old tweet or a screenshot of an old tweet, reposting it, and then adding commentary to it. That's your cut, right? That's your crease, right? It's not simply just posting a picture of somebody's past transgression and leaving it up for other people to interpret. Yes, absolutely enactment, right? It's not just leaving it open for interpretation. It asks people to reinterpret it based on their moral and visceral reaction to somebody being called out. So for those familiar with Black signifying culture, one of the cardinal sins you can have, and this, I'll put this in Black Twitter terms, you never want to be the one, right? The person on the Black Twitter main screen. You never want to be that person, right? And I would argue that's similar in Black culture. You don't want to be the one called out or caught slipping, right? If you can think of the series Cheaters, right? That Cheaters is a perfect example of people who got caught slipping, right? And so in making that I caught you slipping as a digital practice, right? In a space that's ostensibly structured for productive and linear communication, that induces repetition on a libidinal basis. I think I've repeated myself, but hopefully that's helpful.
Wow, that's super helpful. I just, we just have a second or two, and, I was also thinking about memory in relation to Karen's talk, because you surface memories in these moments in your own relationship to the music, and I was wondering if you'd be open to talking for just a second about sort of how memory figures into your kind of work.
I see it as like a kind of breaking of the fourth wall in many respects, to acknowledge the unacknowledged source text. In other words, what is often repressed in order to, I guess, allow work to traffic in certain circles and what have you, right? Or to be accepted, is to obliterate, as what Andre referred to in the beginning, is a kind of the presupposition that what we do is indulge in me search. In a way that's, framed in a derogatory manner, but actually, it is for me just like a way of returning the repressed to the center of the scholarly discourse and the scholarly performance, even, so that that like one can kind of obliterate the idea of the universal subject, and acknowledge that particularity of that errant thought or that stray feeling, right? And we see how, obviously there are people who masterfully pull this off in different ways, and that have, there's only a certain number of people who are permitted to do it. And I'm kind of like, well, what if we all just decided to do it and not worry about it, like being authorized by, or trying to be authorized by like a MacArthur Fellowship or something, whatever it is, right? So, right. Anyway.
Oh, What a
Try this
wonderful-
at home, in other words.
Yes, that's great. That's the perfect way to close out this evening, to try this at home and to bring the kind of care and attention to those objects that mean so much to us in our sort of ordinary everyday lives, to grapple with what they mean and why, and what they can open up to us about the sort of the complex life worlds and histories that we inhabit. So thank you so much, Professor Tongson, Professor Brock, for your really, really incredible presentations today. Thank you, Malika and Rashad, for your amazing Q&A. Thank you, Gail, for being such a great conspirator. Thanks, Lara and Sophia, for all the back end stuff. And thank you all for coming on this beautiful Wednesday evening. It's been such a pleasure to share this time with you.
Thanks, everyone. Such an honor to be in conversation with everyone here, to co-present with André, and to get to be a participant in this wonderful community you've all built.
Thank you. Have a wonderful night, everyone.